I do. Now, Cuba's not high on my list of tourist places to go. It's a pretty pathetic, failed socialist, mismanaged country. But I think we should be free to travel there. And this is where the embargo, it's done in the name of freedom, but it's infringing on the freedom of us as Americans to travel. There's no national security reason why I shouldn't be able to go to Cuba if I wanted to. This shows you how odd the travel ban is. I can actually travel to North Korea or Iran if I wanted to. You have to kind of take a circuitous route. But I can't go to Cuba without a threat of being hauled before the authorities. We've prosecuted teachers and former missionaries for traveling there. You know, Americans traveling abroad are some of the best ambassadors and business people and salespeople, some of the best ambassadors America has. We're cutting ourselves off from a vital source of interaction with the Cuban people and the spreading of ideas and values down there. We should lift the travel ban entirely and let Americans travel freely to Cuba and wherever else they want to go.
Ray Walser, should we lift the travel ban?
I don't think so. I think that what you just reported is that whether we like it or not, the administration has moved forward to address the most pressing sorts of issues, which is the family-to-family issue, the Cuban Americans traveling there. I mean, what they want is really the massive arrival of U.S. tourism, which will, as Frank has pointed out, just put dollars in the regime's bank, will finance sort of the Raul Castro Inc., which is, of course, the hotel industry, the dual currency system. So I firmly think that we should not allow an open, full-fledged lifting of the travel restrictions until there is a genuine transition in Cuba, a real identifiable hemispheric conforming, inter-American charter type of process that begins to open up the doors for democracy on the island.
The United States is the #2 nation behind Canada in sending citizens to Cuba. You would never know, in some senses, that we do have a travel ban. It includes Cuban Americans who visit family members and are allowed to go, and it's fairly simple, but also members of church groups, people going on cultural exchanges, musicians and artists, people involved with colleges and universities. What effect does this have on Cuba, and what effect does it have on the United States?
Well, that situation is changing now with the new regulations, but it wasn't like that under the Bush administration. The special licenses had to be obtained, and it was extremely difficult, if not impossible, to obtain those special licenses for the so-called people-to-people contacts. And the Cuban-American travel, of course, was very limited also. But now that there have been some openings, yes, I think that is going to have a significant effect, because when people get to know one another and when they begin to see what the situation is like from both sides of the strait, there can only be but change. Change is inevitable. And to tell you the truth, Ray, I am convinced at this point, and I have lived this situation for 50 years. I came in 1961. I have been involved in local politics in Miami-Dade County, and I have followed it closely. I am convinced at this point that the main reason, if not perhaps the main reason why many people want to keep the travel embargo in place for Americans, is that they don't want us to see what the reality of Cuba is by going there and seeing it themselves. Because I myself was subject to a number of misconceptions. For example, in 1980, I was a journalist before I was a lawyer, and I was writing for a magazine from Washington called Nuestro. I went to Cuba during the Mariel boat lift, and I came back, and when after a few days we had a party in my house with my wife and a number of other journalists from the community. I was talking about my experiences in Cuba. And at one point I said that I had gone to Copelia. Copelia is, you might know, a famous ice cream stand. And I had gone to Copelia, and there were crowds over there, and people were doing this and dancing and the other. And somebody who was an intelligent and well-informed individual, in my estimation, jumped and said, well, that's impossible. You can't do that in Cuba, because in Cuba, you're not allowed to have meetings of 3 or more people. I said, what are you talking about? You know, there are meetings of 3 or more people in Copelia and the Malecón and elsewhere. But this is the misconception, an example of the misconceptions that we have about Cuba. We have this idea that Cuba is a completely Stalinist regime, that people are just bursting at the seams and want to rise up and rebel. And that is not the case. Well,